Moving from ambition to action and practically delivering the infrastructure that New Zealand needs will require all of us, from central and local governments to the private sector and everyone in between. This session, Delivering Together, is focused on working together to move from strategy to delivery. And it's my privilege to be facilitating the next panel discussion with inspiring local leaders from across Aotearoa. I'm going to introduce them one by one, down the end there. Neil Holdham, who's the Mayor of New Plymouth. Alex Walker, who is the Mayor of Central Hawke's Bay. Paula Southgate, who is the Mayor of Kirikiriroa, Hamilton. And of course, Arahia Bennett, who is the CEO of Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for being with us.
Kia ora.
There is just so much I want to get through over the next 40 minutes or so. If you've got questions, don't forget to flick them through via Slido, and I'll try and get to those when I can. Alex, I'm going to start with you, because your region was absolutely smashed in February of this year. I just wondered, from your perspective so far, how has the response been? How is the recovery?
Well, massive question. Kia ora, everybody. I think an opportunity, there's been a little bit of reflection of not a lot of understanding of what's happening in Hawke's Bay at the moment and the scale of what's going on. And in fact, the Associate Minister spoke about it just earlier. And I suppose the first thing I could do is give you a geography lesson. So who's from Hawke's Bay in the room? Who's from the Hawke's Bay region? Kia ora. Hey guys, actually not many. Geography lesson, okay? 1.4 million hectares. It takes you 4 hours to drive from the top to the bottom. It's a really big area. And it's cut basically into 4 different types of areas. And Central Hawke's Bay, which is the district that I'm the Mayor of, it's not actually in the centre, don't ask, it's a long story. It's the southern quarter of that land area, of that 1.4 million hectares. Wairoa district is the top quarter that goes up to Mahia. Hastings district is kind of half of the land area in the middle, and Napier City Council area, the urban area, is a little spot in the middle of the region. And the reality is that Cyclone Gabrielle tested our ability to act both locally and regionally, because on the morning of the 14th of February, we lost every single lifeline that we assume that we have. Roads, monitoring of rivers. We were blind to what was happening with our rivers, what was happening with the rainfall. We had no power, we had no radios, we had no cell phones, and it was a pretty terrifying experience for everybody involved. And what has happened is that we have got a depth and complexity of damage which goes from the top to the bottom of the region. So you can get off the plane in Napier and within 10 minutes see some absolute devastation from the impacts of the cyclone. But you can get in a car and drive 2 hours to the south to the coastal village of Porangaho and see the same kind of thing, where a river has just absolutely decimated a village, taken out the marae, the urapa, and had the same impact. You can hop in that car and go 2 hours to the north of Napier, to Wairoa, and see the same thing. So to articulate the level of damage to our infrastructure and to our people is actually really challenging. And we've got at least $1.4 billion worth of damage to our horticulture sector. Our Hawke's Bay horticulture sector contributes $1.2 billion to New Zealand GDP, and we've got $1.4 billion of damage, so it's pretty massive in the context. Beef and Lamb New Zealand just released some data that says our primary sector, agriculture sector, are maybe 400 million of damage on farm, and our roading network is probably the big thing that's easiest to get a number around at the moment. 4,200 kilometres of local roads in our region. That's 90% of the roading network, the other 10% is state highway. Those 4,200 kilometres of roads have probably got between $1.2 and $1.5 billion worth of damage just to reinstate. So the scale, the geographic scale and the depth of that impact is huge, and we're working really hard to get the local intel to build into a regional picture to have a great plan is the stage that we're at.
Are you getting what you need at this point?
We're getting some signals about what does funding look like, which helps. But actually there is a piece where we need to invest into the region to get the right skills, expertise there to help us with that planning and coordination to get that right. I don't think we've quite got the support for that bit yet, but our Chief Executive of our recovery agency, Ross McLeod, he's here looking at the big picture and bringing, looking for people to support around him, but there's probably more of that we need.
Okay, I wonder if I can go to Paula and Neil on this point. You are both mayors in regions that are relatively close, geographically speaking, to Hawke's Bay and to Auckland, of course. What do you think collectively we learned about the state of our regional infrastructure? Paula?
Well, for a start, Hamilton came off lightly in the last set of series, and it's not just one Cyclone Gabrielle, it's a whole series of events. We came off lightly, really, but that's there by the grace of God, because 4 degrees further over and the storm would have centred on Hamilton and done damage to different communities. So we're always that close away from an emergency. But what happens in the situation where other parts of the country are under the hammer is that a whole of local government New Zealand needs to get behind them, because we're a small nation.
Yeah.
So we need to bring all our resources to help our colleagues. So Hamilton, for example, sent a lot of resource and expertise to Auckland. We coordinated some funding for Auckland, but we know they're not fixed yet, and there's a lot more funding to go. I think one of the key things is we need to be ahead of the game in terms of our own resilience, which we've been hearing from experts over the last day and a half, so that we future-proof our system to minimise the damage.
Yeah.
The other point I will make is that a disaster in any part of the country impacts on all local government, because resources quite rightfully get diverted to recovery and response. You've got to have communities with their basic needs met. And so I can foresee some of the funding through NZTA and other ways going into the areas where the need is the greatest, and that's going to divert some of the investment from some of the future-proofing of infrastructure.
Which means when you get hit by a storm, let's hope that doesn't happen in 5 years' time, all of a sudden actually your infrastructure isn't necessarily as resilient as it might have been if that funding had been maintained.
So planning for something that's not happened yet is really hard in a political context, but it's absolutely what we must do.
Yeah. Neil?
Yeah, look, probably the only thing I could add is it just reflects that our planning is actually reasonably unsophisticated in terms of we have these events somewhere every few years, but they have to make a big budget announcement and go away. And I mean, realistically, if you look at large infrastructure companies, they have a reactive maintenance budget, and it's probably formed on a rolling 5-year average of works that have been undertaken. But at a nation, we're not doing that. I think local government has come together really well in working with mana whenua to deal with the immediate response. And then government, anyone in government that's dealing with risk should know, you could just probably say we're going to have an event, a significant event every 3 or 4 years, and it's going to cost, I don't know, $2 to $4 billion.
Yeah.
And that seems to be reasonably accurate. So therefore, we need to have the facilities in place and also the processes. The other thing, I think, and this is something as we approach this kind of climate resilience piece, is we're all going to rush in and build everything back exactly as it was in exactly the same place. And we need to actually look at our models, and I think hopefully through the spatial planning work, we can make decisions about there are assets that will no longer be insurable by 2030, and if something happens, we should be taking the steps to have a plan to relocate them and make it easy for infrastructure providers to get access to land and easements and things to actually move things quickly when they get destroyed.
Talk to us about that second point a little bit more. How do you enable that kind of functionality, preparing for a future where, say, an asset isn't necessarily insurable, but also you don't know when it's going to be wiped out, or even if it will be wiped out at some point.
So first of all, you lay, across your GIS, we've got pretty good things across district plans across the country that says, here's the kind of sea level rise assumptions, here's your risks of liquefaction and seismic. And so you've kind of got your no-go areas, and then you can lay that across your critical infrastructure and say, for us, sewage and pumps, water reservoirs and things, and you go, okay, they're not ideally located. We should have in a capital works plan a program that says over the next 30 years we'll be moving these things. But the issue for particularly private infrastructure providers is the process of getting an easement and relocating something like an electricity substation. This is a 10-year process.
Yeah.
And the government, they've fast-tracked a wind farm in South Taranaki. They fast-tracked that 3 years ago and it's still in court. So, I mean, we've heard our Prime Minister talk about the need to speed this up. I'm not sure they actually know how to do that. And the issue is you do trample on local rights and views when you do it. But the bigger picture is that, you know, the substation in Hawke's Bay will have to be rebuilt. And the sooner it's rebuilt, the better. But if it's rebuilt in the same place, you're going to have the same problem.
I'm going to keep us ticking through a few different subjects. So if there's something you want to say, you want to pick up on someone else's point, please don't be backwards in coming forward. Out of here, we are in this amazing facility that might not have been here if not for the disaster in 2011. I said yesterday, going around Christchurch, my old hometown, I prickle with pride. It's amazing to see Christchurch as it is today. But I know that the last 12 years have been extraordinarily difficult for people in the city. When you look at a disaster like the one that has hit Hawke's Bay and parts of Auckland this year, what do you think are the key lessons from your perspective that we can take from the response to the Canterbury earthquake?
Great question. Kia ora everyone. I think one of the amazing aspects or the positivity that came out of when I think about earthquakes going back to 2010-11 was actually sort of the beginning of a fusion with iwi Māori. But before on this landscape or in this environment, Ngāi Tahu didn't have much of a role apart from being one of the bigger property landlords in Christchurch, and a lot of that was taken away overnight, and as we know, the infrastructure that was recreated and developed then came under a different dimension. It was no longer under iwi from our settlement. But the learnings that have come out from then were actually, it's a small window, it is a short window. You've got an opportunity to make changes and come together very quickly. Otherwise, it becomes more prolonged, it starts stretching out, we become more bureaucratic. And I know during that time, in those first few years, a group of chief executives across the wider Greater Christchurch, companies, etc., we all came together and we actually looked at what are the changes that we want to make in this city, and what is the role that we want to have going forward. And I think from those learnings, I know from a Ngāi Tahu point of view, we participated quite strongly from the SERA legislation that was created. We found ourselves in the legislation. Iwi wants the same for what the wider communities, I mean, we all live in houses, we all go to work, we all are part of the communities, so we don't want anything strange or different. So it's important for us to actually come together, collaborate, and it is a short window to actually try and affect change. Otherwise, we'll end up going back to what we had before. And I think, as you say, you're prickling with pride. If you go around, if you're not from Christchurch, or even if you've been away from Christchurch for some time, you will start, and I mean, there's argument on both sides. Some people say it's so slow. Others will say it's actually starting to look uniquely different. And the part that we have with pride is actually there's a real fusion of iwi presence, iwi capability, competence and participation in the infrastructure recovery.
Do we have to wait for disaster for iwi to have that kind of involvement?
Well, it seems like that's what happens whenever, one thing about iwi is that we are quite long term, so our thinking is iwi will never die. And so we look out into the future and we're planning ahead. But, and we know around the 3-year cycles in terms of leadership changes. And I think this is one of the learnings that we should be taking to actually pull together and starting to look at, and through the resilience planning, setting in place these sorts of things going forward. We know at some point there will be the Alpine fault that will go. So what are we all doing about that now in terms of getting ahead? It's not just about sitting around waiting, oh, will it be this year, that year sort of thing. These are the sorts of things that we should be doing together.
And I mean, Ngāi Tahu is a prime example of an iwi with strong business acumen, to say the least. Are there opportunities for iwi to invest? We're always hunting, and I think, and as I said earlier, we want the same for everyone else in the community, and it's important even when we are looking to invest
ours is a circular economy, so our investing doesn't mean that it's all tied up, and we're not offshore either. So we are actually about giving back into the community, and I know since settlement we've put in about 745 million back into the community. And I said to the Treasury Minister, that's actually money gone back into the national community. Yeah. It's not just going into individual iwi, into pockets. It's actually about building a greater community. And so, yes, we're interested.
That's something in Hawke's Bay we've lent into quite heavily, and within 2 weeks of the cyclone, we agreed across the leadership in Hawke's Bay, across all of our iwi leaders and mayors and chairs across our local government, that we had to have a team approach to lifting the game into recovery, lifting that view of where we're investing, how we're building resiliency. Because actually, if you look at a micro level of what happened in the cyclone, if you have a grid map of where there is deprivation or where there is Māori communities, they were overrepresented in the impacts that were there. And so actually we have to shift the dial on how we are both responding but then also recovering. And actually there's just been the introduction of some revised civil defence emergency management legislation, which is actually going to help us bring mana whenua into that emergency response recovery in a far more structured way, to allow everyone to do it, not just when we've had an emergency, but actually in the planning and governance of that before it happens, which is also really vital.
Paula?
I was going to add that a couple of things. First of all, we're obliged to give effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and that speaks for itself. But also, if we consider that iwi and Māori have an incredible set of resources, they have historic understanding about local areas because they've been living there for so very long. They've got mātauranga Māori and also all those kind of things to bring to the table. And we've heard from the experts in infrastructure here over the last few days that you've got to have everybody at the beginning of the design of the solution for what you're trying to aim. And in Hamilton, we're particularly aware that Waikato Tainui are significant developers at scale. At scale, they have a lot of resources, they're pulling the same way as you say. They want a strong economy for Hamilton and the Waikato. They've got the inland port in development. They're big players in commercial development. They hold quite a lot of land. And then when you think about inclusivity and diversity and how that has been proven to lift productivity, it's a no-brainer to work with Māori from the very beginning.
Over the last couple of days, we've heard heaps about a couple of themes. Number one is just the certainty around a pipeline of works. Number two is how those works should be funded and the extent to which private capital should be used. I want to pick up on those themes a little bit because I know this is something close to your hearts. When are your 10-year plans due? Next June?
Next year.
Right? Mm-hmm. So how does your long-term planning align with the funding cycles and the planning coming out of central government?
It doesn't, is the short answer. 2 words, it doesn't.
And particularly now, confused by we've got to do recovery, but there's these pots of money that have been announced in a budget, but there's no criteria, there's no certainty, there's nothing. So we're building budgets that have got massive assumptions in them about, do we rate for that, do we borrow to finance that, or is there going to be another funding mechanism? It's fraught.
Yeah, and look, the political timelines, and we've heard about the role of politicians over the last couple of days as well, the political timelines don't align. You've got national elections at the moment, and we've just had the local government elections, all 3-year terms. And even though everybody agrees that a 4 or 5-year term would be much more expedient in terms of consistency and clarity of getting things done, we just never get there. So I'm going to keep pushing for that longer term for both local and central government. But all of the pots of money become available at different times for different purposes. So the ability to integrate into one sort of strategic approach is really difficult. Yeah. You have to be on the ball. And the other thing I don't like about it is it makes me compete with my colleagues for the same fund. It's like a bucket of resource, and we all put our ladle in and say, can we have this much? Yeah. Neil wants some money for a different purpose. I want some money for a different purpose. And it becomes very competitive as opposed to aligned to the strategic growth outcomes.
And no one wants to be the runt, right? Left at the end.
And I think if you look at the model that we've had in New Zealand politics over the last 15 years, some of our infrastructure organisations, and I'll pick on Waka Kotahi because it's easy to pick on them, the basic model they had to take the hypothecated fund and allocate it to what was traditionally maintenance and growth worked reasonably well. And then we had national, bring in the roads of national significance. They bumped up RUC and fuel taxes, but not by enough. And that started what we've seen as the systemic rundown in the assets. Then we've had successive governments come in and add in pet projects, whether it's rail, safety, decarbonisation, mode shift, without adequate funding, to the point where now Waka Kotahi, probably half of its CapEx program is not funded through the hypothecated fund. It's funded through ministerial pet projects. So we've had this $6 billion cyclone response announced. There's no detail, there's no process, there's no asset allocation methodology. So now I think we're all comfortable with that money going to support the communities that have been impacted. But again, there's no model, and so what it will come down to is politicians wandering around announcing here's 200 here and 100 here. Where's the transparency? Where's the discipline? It goes against good asset management principles, and what we've seen is the governance in the government diving across the line into management, and they're no longer setting direction and providing funding. They're actually getting into the gearbox and picking winners, and it's really unhealthy for everybody in the market.
Yeah, we had a really interesting presentation on that yesterday, pointing out how inefficient the assets are, generally speaking, when they are, when they are procured by politicians for political reasons, as opposed to other forms of procurement. Alex, you said something really interesting to me the other day. You said decisions to say no are the hardest. Can you unpack that for me?
Yeah, well, it is, particularly when you get a passionate group of a community or something behind behind a project. And actually, we need to move away from kind of a yes-no decision-making about projects and actually about outcomes and programs that are going to take us there. And that's something that we've done in my local community, where water infrastructure was really clearly a priority in our community a number of years ago. And we didn't go and have a community consultation about should we have a floating wetland or should we do an activated sludge treatment on our wastewater. We said, actually, this is a priority. The outcomes are wastewater needs to come out of the river. We need connected communities that have got safe drinking water and that it's resilient. And we created a program that then could be partnered with contractors and professional development, professional services contractors to just get out there and deliver it. And that's all we've got to get back to be able to plan for the future, is actually why we're doing it. And that's what drives our programs.
And talking from a big metro perspective here, from an input, just put my big city hat on, we're quite well advanced in our spatial planning. We've got a 30-year infrastructure plan. We've got the future-proof growth plan for the sub-region, etc., and I can go on about some other plans that we have in place. What I want is to find a mechanism where the strategic planning and funding go hand in hand, instead of being this forever competitive scenario where you're not quite sure what parts of your strategic plan you're actually going to be able to deliver. And the only source we've got at the moment is the ratepayer, largely. Fees and services, really small end, right? User pays is still small end, but rates is the big end, unless we get government support.
An interesting question here, a couple of questions on the same theme via Slido. People are asking for your thoughts on the skills and labour shortage in the regions and what industry can be doing to try and address that shortage. I'm not sure if any of you have thoughts on that, and Arahia, if you do too.
Yeah, I love that question. Actually, it's a huge challenge, and there's a lot of it is actually the challenge of government departments involved in reform, where all our great planners are in MFE or they're in Kāinga Ora and that they've exited the regions. And I think there are some things that we can collectively do, and some of them can be about commitments to progressive procurement outcomes. When we're doing things, how are you, as the contractors and the deliverers that are working with us, how are you working with us to make sure that a young local person comes in, or a small Māori business as part of the subcontracting environment, and actually helping us pipeline young people and local people through into the workforce. And it's really powerful. I was talking to one of our local contractors just yesterday who had done a piece of work with us. It was a small piece of work. They'd done 5 local employments. This was 2 years ago. 3 of those 5 still worked for them, and one of those people had brought their husband and their son to come and work in that contracting business. And you start to see the pipeline and the culture of work and commitment to construction that comes from doing that.
We've struggled with, we just got to the point where we can't wait for government. So we've been trying to advocate for investment in our polytechnic, which is now part of Te Pūkenga we just gave up. And so we actually built them an infrastructure school just in our industrial area with a view that we can't wait for Wellington. And that's really working with our local construction partners, and it's working really well because they're actually out there in the environment. The local businesses can take a look at it. There's basically full employment uptake of the course, and it's a very practical sort of hands-on approach.
So council made this?
Yes.
Yeah,
and
great.
and it was just a view. Look, we've made a real focus on lifting our investment in infrastructure and trying to catch up on particularly the below ground stuff that nobody really cares about over the past 6 years. We identified that we needed more competition in the market. We've been working really closely with our iwi partners and talking about this idea of scaffolding in small businesses, if we can help small ones grow to be medium-sized ones. So we have head contractors and we've written long contracts, but that allows them to then invest in the smaller contracting partners. But then we needed to create a pipeline of workers to then feed through to support. And the issue we have is that the Three Waters work is not attractive to the workforce. They all want to be newsreaders and live glamorous lives.
Much more of a future in infrastructure
Well,
than there
the
is in
point
media.
is they'll have work for life.
Yeah.
And what we want to do is make sure that we can make that work safe, rewarding, and I think there was an earlier speaker talking about we have to talk about water positively so that people want to work in it. But there are jobs for life there, and that's so we're doing our bit because we know we can't wait for Wellington.
Yeah, I am going to ask about Three Waters in a couple of minutes. I'm trying to burn through as many things as I can quickly. Arahia, very quickly, are there lessons, do you think, for local government and for industry in the way that Ngāi Tahu seeks to foster local talent?
Yeah, it's always, we have quite clear frameworks internally to the organisation and right across our holdings around procurement practices in terms of building our own capability, capacity, engaging our own in terms of from smaller to medium, larger size contracts. So we're leaning in, and again, it's about that sort of circular economy right through to, and we've probably got a lot of partners here today in terms of internships, cadetships, etc. But one of the things that we are experiencing, and we all know about the sense of folks moving from one job to another and trying to keep people in employment. But what we're experiencing is mainly, and it is quite positive in the sense that companies, organisations, government, local government are really leaning into the Te Tiriti relationship and looking for capability, capacity that is iwi Māori, or if you've even worked in an iwi Māori organisation. And what we're discovering is that a lot of our people are moving out because they're getting better remuneration. And so we're ending up becoming this this organisation that's almost incubating, growing, developing, and then our capability is actually moving on. And that's not a negative thing, that's actually a positive thing. But at the same time, it still puts us under pressure on wanting to actually work for our own. So there are, on that continuum, there are a number of things that we're doing to actually sort of make sure we've got a circular economy, but also contributing into the wider companies.
Just want to add a different spin. Totally support that there's a role for Te Pūkenga to get on with this, getting people into the right careers as a job for schools in there as well. But just to put another slant, and a big shout out to Mayor's Task Force for Jobs, which has been recognised as a very successful collaborative program among the mayors. What I was going to say is we also need to look at stop the bleeding. We're getting Australia pilching some of our best talent, and globally as well. And some of that's, to me, about doing what we do well in local government, which is create communities where young people want to live. When Hamilton's median age is 32.5 years, we've got a really young population. How are we going to make Hamiltonians want to stay in Kirikiri or Hamilton and not jet off somewhere else? So that's all about community building with them to create the future-proof communities where they want to live and contribute to.
Future for Local Government work is ongoing. And a lot of conversation and debate over at the moment as to the utility of amalgamation of councils. And I wondered if you each have some thoughts on where that might not be appropriate. Neil?
Yeah, well, I think if the Three Waters goes through as it is now, for smaller councils it's inevitable. You're talking about 30 to 40% of their revenue, and they simply, in terms of the complexity of the environment that we're operating in and the changes and the other reforms, they're just going to struggle to cover their overheads across a far limited revenue base. So I think that the issue is these things have got, the decisions will have to come from the smaller councils wanting to opt to have a chat with their neighbours. But it is amalgamation by stealth.
Do you mean that as part of the Three Waters program, as those 10 entities?
Yeah, I believe that through those 10 entities, there's a number of smaller councils that they're on the margins of viability right now in terms of trying to run, roading networks, and you rip out, the core part of their engineering teams, planning, procurement, and some of them won't be viable. And so they will have those discussions. And I think you can see through the Spatial Planning Act, the government has a view of a kind of template of about 14 regions, and that's their kind of long-term game. And look, I think that the issue is, if you asked me 7 years ago, I would have said, one Taranaki, we can do it. But I've come to realise that Stratford has, they've got their own unique character, and they've made their decisions, as has South Taranaki. I have real respect for my colleagues. I'm not going to be advocating for them to do anything they don't want to do. I do believe in the efficiencies of scale. I came from Powerco. We were, the second largest utility in energy and gas, and there were some benefits of scale, and I think that there are and continue to support that. But I think the same. I'm also a big fan of subsidiarity. And if you go to Stratford and you see what that community has done based on what they want to do, there's real value in that. And I don't think we want to lose that. And as I say, I'm not a person that's going to advocate for some community outside of my rohi. It's up to them to determine what they want to do. And I think the thing is that as local government, we work together quite well. But certainly the environment that we're operating in, the direction from Wellington is really squeezing us, and they're 90% of the revenue base, and we are sort of 9 or 10. After Three Waters, will be 6 or 7, and I don't have any reason to believe there won't be another bunch of reform coming to take roading away, and then there'll be more unfounded mandates. They want to put pressure on us.
I thought I was going to give you a good example of where local government is so disparate around the region, but around the country, but I actually ended up agreeing with what Neil just said. So my council is a really good example. Central Hawke's Bay District is the 8th smallest council in the country, but it is the top highest performing alongside Waimakariri District Council, which are independently graded as AA council mark rating. Really high performing. And you go to, what does that mean in terms of governance, leadership, strategy, and democracy for good local leadership and good outcomes, compared to what does that mean for having a balance sheet to do multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects? And it actually has got some different parts to it. So what I'm looking forward to from the Future for Local Government review is some platform to help us cement in place how we operate as Hawke's Bay region, which is that we have really great leadership at local levels that reflect the different parts of our communities, but we are working to bring our infrastructure together, our planning together, and the way that we work together in spatial planning, Three Waters, and even how we're programming around local roading and recovery. All of these things are adding to that we can build scale without the forced boundary amalgamation, which our Hawke's Bay community voted out in 2015 very clearly. So I'm looking for ways that the legislation is going to help us strengthen that collaborative view with mana whenua and with the region together.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I support Local Government New Zealand's stance on enabling a new form of localism, and we're going to have conversations about what does that mean when we think about localism. Hamilton City Council is not looking to subsume any of its neighbours in any way, but we are looking for strategic alignment. And in fact, we've already demonstrated that we do that very well. We've got future proof as I've said before, with Waipa and Waikato, which is a coalition of the willing across a number of strategic growth projects. We have Hamilton to Auckland strategy. We work in the Golden Triangle really closely with Tauranga. So those are the kind of relationships that we'll continue to be exploring, especially in light of what Neil says, Three Waters. What does that mean? How can we do better? How can we make our resources and our expertise stretch? We've got to have those conversations in that area. But no, I'm not looking to be a superpower, and I don't think Hamilton or New Zealand is going to be, superpowers all over. I think it is about bringing that new local knowledge to the table in a collegial and comprehensive way.
I suppose the question is, would economies of scale, of greater scale, help us to achieve greater resilience when it comes to
Absolutely, they
infrastructure?
would.
Yeah.
We can't do it. We've heard it. We've heard from every second speaker here. We can't go it alone. So the question is, how do we come together to do that? Are we forced into something, or do we have coalitions of the willing that make sense based on the stakeholders and partnerships that bring the best outcomes? Co-design, collaboration. We've heard those words, and I support that approach myself.
Yeah. Out of here, very interesting to see Ngāti Whātua in Auckland today. Ngāti Mu Blair, not Renata, who's been here at the conference, but Ngāti Mu coming out and saying, whoa, Taiho on their sale of the airport shares, just sell some of that waterfront land to Ngāti Whātua. We're ready to snap things up. As it stands, he's being 100% serious
Wouldn't
as
have
well.
thought anything less from him.
Yes,
Yeah.
no. I wondered if you could talk to us about what you think is the role for local iwi when it comes to actually funding local infrastructure in the future.
Look, it's really interesting hearing the expectations of local government. If I think about iwi, we have a role and a responsibility to be contributing in the community, and I just gave you some figures earlier around that return back into the community. Our contribution can be in a number of ways, and when I think about our deed of settlement and local infrastructure and communities, we come from that history of actually preservation, protection, and actually wanting to bring back where we've come from before. And actually, when we think about water, etc., we're no different. We just want clean drinking water, and our role, therefore, should be about collaborating. It should be looking at whatever JVs we've got going, but participating in that collaborative way. So the question is, yes, we should be participating. We want to be involved. We want to be engaged in a number of ways. And I think many of you probably are already in participating relationships with iwi, hapu, and even trusts right across the country. So I think there is a role there.
Okay, we are fast running out of time, only a few minutes left, but it's been interesting over the last 36 hours or so to hear from both National and Labour when it comes to their plans in this space. National releasing its 5-point infrastructure plan yesterday. The Minister for Infrastructure, Megan Woods, speaking to the audience here at Building Nations. So I wondered if each of you could reflect, certainly for the mayors here, if you could reflect on Labour versus National and what those different approaches might mean, what they might mean for your relationship with central government.
Do you want me to start? Devil's in the detail, to be quite honest. We've heard, there was a lot of good stuff in all of the presentations from both parties, actually, but there's a lot of uncertainty that still sits under that. There's some numbers being banded, 6 million, 1 billion, this kind of thing, but the detail underneath that is not known. So, I'm going to reserve my judgment till I see how that money is going to be prioritised and invested. The main thing for me is to make sure that Hamilton meets its growth objectives. The government have made us a tier 1 council. They've said you will grow and you will grow fast. My question is, how do we do that without your support? So I've heard some good things to ponder on. I'm going to look very closely at the 5-point plan because that was only just announced. But at the end of the day, we need certainty and security. We're sort of playing in soft sand, and all the time it's moving.
Well, the thing I'm interested in is the structure of the relationship between central government and local government. And I know Megan Woods came here yesterday and said, oh, look, actually, as it stands, we're significantly improving central government's planning and relationship with many local councils around the country. Of course, National, one of its points in its 5-point plan is for much better coordination. So I just wonder if if we can distinguish between those approaches at the moment, and if they necessarily...
And I think it's important to note, I remember going for a tramp with an infrastructure manager who will remain unnamed, and he was a bit slow in taking selfies, and I asked him to hurry up, and his comment was, "Watch it, son, we call the shots and you follow." And we see that a lot. It's a command and control relationship. That actually, you know, in terms of if taxation is a proxy for control, our ability to control our environment is shrinking. I think that Labour and National, you know, that one could be a branch of the other. There's very little difference. But what we can see from both of them is they refuse to disclose transparency what their long-term financial kind of plan and process is. And either they don't have one or they don't want to tell us. But I think it's more likely that they don't. And, you know, what I would like to see is that we put, whether it's health, transport, education, which I think are, you know, the three key things, and potentially welfare, forecast the costs out 30 years and have a big grown-up conversation about what level we want to deliver at, how much it's going to cost. Because I think most Kiwis will be prepared to actually pay for it, and then we can put that behind us and get on and get it done.
So I'm kind of political animal. I really want to be able to go really hard on this, but do you know what? I'm on all fronts underwhelmed. And it's kind of frustrating because actually what we know is that there are really great people locally in our regions who, given the scope to get on and do it, will. And what we're seeing from both, what I heard yesterday was both on a pathway where ministers are controlling the pipeline. And whether that's currently in the Transport Division or whether it's what National talked about with streamlining consenting and the Minister of Infrastructure getting to sign off big infrastructure projects, like it just feels like the same. I can't see the difference, and I'm kind of underwhelmed because I don't think it actually transforms it in the way that we need it to be.
No, look, I totally agree. Local government New Zealand has been asking for a much closer relationship with central government, to be around the table solving the problems together. At the moment that doesn't exist. Central government does control a lot of the narrative. We submit our thoughts to central government. We hope that they take them on board, but whether they do or whether they don't, we need to formalise that partnership between local government New Zealand and central government.
I think just a couple of comments. Iwi dances to its own tune. And that's based on its settlement and the protection of the settlement. And this is not new for us. Mm-hmm. We'll continue to be moving forward, but when it comes to working with any of the political parties, we'll strategically engage in that dance, and we'll just be continuing to do our own thing.
Hey, thank you so much. We are out of time. I note that there are some spare chairs in front of us, so feel free for this afternoon's political panel to sit right here and heckle away throughout the afternoon. Won't you join me in thanking Neil Holdham, Alex Walker, Paula Southgate, and Arahia Bennett. There we go. Thank you.